There is a woman who lives quietly in Los Angeles. She is 72 years old. She is not hidden, but she is no longer present in the machinery that spent 3 decades telling the world what she was for. She has a partner. She has a daughter. She has a granddaughter named Holland. And she has, in recent years, begun saying in public the things that the cameras, in all their decades of attention, were never once pointed at. She won the Academy Award. She filed for bankruptcy. She bought an entire town in Georgia and sold it at a 95% loss. She was the most photographed woman in America and could not walk through a grocery store without her body telling her to stop. She was the Breck shampoo girl, and the Bond girl, and Vicky Vale, and Lynn Bracken. She was the woman in the white suit stepping out of a Rolls Royce in a Tim Burton film. And she was the woman playing Eminem's mother in a Detroit trailer 20 years later. And she was the woman on a Red Table Talk set with her daughter beside her, finally naming the thing she had been carrying since she was a girl in Athens, Georgia, who faked illness to stay home and be near her mother. The covers never told that story. The magazine credits never included it. The box office numbers had no column for it. This is the story beneath the image. Stay with it. The woman on those covers was always more than what any lens was given access to. That truth did not arrive quietly. It arrived over 50 years, through courtrooms and Oscar stages and grocery stores and a small Georgia town that never became what she dreamed it would. And it is still arriving now. Athens, Georgia in the 1950s had a specific sound. On a Sunday morning, it came through the windows of Methodist households along streets lined with water oaks. A sound of bells and cicadas, and the particular weight of southern summer air that does not so much arrive as settle. It was a university town, which meant it had an intellectual current beneath its surface, a sense that the world beyond it was not entirely hypothetical. But it was also deeply, specifically Southern, rooted in place, in family, in the structures of a community where everyone knew what everyone else was doing, and where belonging was both a gift and a form of pressure. Into that world, on December 8, 1953, Kimala Ann Basinger was born, the third of 5 children. Her siblings were James Michael, known as Mick, and Skip and Ashley and Barbara. 5 children in a household where performance, in music, in movement, in presentation, was not unusual. It was the family's native vocabulary. Her father was Donald Wade Basinger. He was a big band jazz musician who had become a loan company manager, the practical accommodation that music so often demands. And he was also a United States Army soldier who had landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. That is not a small detail. A man who walked through the smoke of that morning and came home to Georgia, to jazz, to 5 children. That combination of things produces a specific atmosphere in a household. A knowledge, never quite spoken, that the world contains terrors that do not announce themselves, that survival is not guaranteed, that what is ordinary is also, always, precarious. Her mother was Ann Lee, born Cordell in 1925. She had been a model. She had been an actress and a swimmer. She had appeared in films, in the water ballet chorus of Esther Williams productions, a world where a woman's physical grace was both art and commodity, where the camera rewarded the body's discipline and asked very little about what was happening inside the person performing it. Ann Lee Basinger had her own relationship with the camera, her own negotiation with what it meant to be seen. And she had something else, an anxiety that was not always manageable, a private struggle that her daughter watched and absorbed and was permanently shaped by. Kim Basinger has described in documented interviews watching her mother carry that anxiety. The watching produced its own anxiety in the child, a specific fear that something would happen to her mother, that if she left for school, the world might close around the woman who anchored it. She faked illness. She stayed home. The school eventually tested her and confirmed what the family had been living with: anxiety, present and consequential, in a child who was otherwise, by all outward appearances, entirely ordinary. She was also, from the age of 3, a dancer. Her parents enrolled her in ballet to combat the shyness, the body as the first language when words were too frightening to form in public. She danced from age 3 to her mid-teens, and she was, by her own account, profoundly shy. She has described herself as extremely shy and lonely, a child who would nearly stop breathing when asked to address the class, who felt the world as a place that could become suddenly too large and too open and too demanding. And yet, at 16, she entered the Athens Junior Miss pageant. She won. She won Junior Miss Georgia, and she went to the national competition, and Eileen Ford of the Ford Modeling Agency was watching. The girl who could not speak to the class was now standing in a room where a woman who built careers from faces had decided that her face was worth a conversation. The contradiction between the interior and the exterior was already fully formed. It did not resolve itself at 16. It did not resolve itself ever. It ran the full length of her life, from Athens to New York to Los Angeles to a courthouse and an Oscar stage and a television set in 2022 where she finally said what it had cost her. Even now, at 72, Basinger connects what she became in public to what she watched her mother carry in private. That connection is not incidental. It is the architecture of everything that follows. New York in the early 1970s asked specific things of a young woman from Athens, Georgia, who had just said yes to the Ford Modeling Agency. It asked her to become a surface, to learn the precise grammar of presentation, the angle of the face, the quality of stillness before the shutter, the translation of a self into an image that could sell shampoo or perfume, or the idea of a life that looked better than whoever was holding the magazine. She arrived. She became, within a relatively short time, one of the agency's working models, appearing on dozens of magazine covers, in hundreds of advertisements, commanding $1,000 a day at a rate that, in the mid-1970s, placed her in the upper tier of commercial modeling. She became the Breck shampoo girl, a face that appeared on the back of magazines in kitchens and dentist offices and waiting rooms across America, a face that people recognized without knowing her name. For a woman who had already spent years learning to present the exterior while protecting the interior, the shy girl who had learned to cheerleader, the anxious girl who had learned to win beauty pageants, the modeling world's central demand was not entirely unfamiliar. It was a familiar demand at a much higher price in a much larger room. But she was also, during these same years, training at the neighborhood playhouse in New York. This matters precisely because it was not the obvious choice. The model, who was already earning real money from the face, was simultaneously attending an acting school that took craft seriously as a discipline, that understood performance as something built from interior resources, not manufactured from exterior presentation. The tension between those two projects, the career that was paying and the craft that was forming, was not accidental. It was a deliberate navigation. She was building something that the modeling world had no category for, and she knew it. She turned down a recurring role on Charlie's Angels. In the mid-1970s, that was not a small decision. The show was one of the highest rated on American television. A recurring role would have been a guaranteed platform, a reliable income, a face in American living rooms every week. She declined it. The reasons are hers. She has noted an interest in something the industry had not yet offered her. But the decision itself is evidence of a creative instinct that was already operating independently of the industry's preferred path for a woman who looked the way she looked. In 1976, she made her television debut, appearing in Gemini Man and Dog and Cat, early credits in a career that was beginning to move from the magazine page to the screen. She trained, she worked, she built. She was being paid $1,000 a day to be looked at, and she remained, underneath it all, a woman who had once faked illness to avoid being seen. The modeling world never knew what it was sitting next to. It saw the face, recorded the face, sold the face. The craft that was being built alongside it existed in a different register entirely. Quieter, less immediately legible, building towards something that the magazine covers had no space to represent. The camera had been finding her for years. It had not yet been given access to what she was actually doing when she stood inside a frame. That was coming. but not yet in any room the modeling world controlled. The childhood anxiety did not leave when she left Athens. It did not leave when she left New York. It traveled with her, not as a diagnosis she carried in her pocket, but as a pattern written into the body, present in the way a crowded room could suddenly feel too small, the way a public demand could register as a physical warning rather than a manageable challenge. Agoraphobia is a specific thing. It is an anxiety disorder characterized by fear of and avoidance of situations where escape might be difficult or where help would not be available during a panic attack. It is related to generalized anxiety, shares its roots, its chemistry, its history, but it is distinct from it. It has a specific geography, the open space, the unfamiliar place, the store, the street, the situation that is not the safe interior. It is the body's decision to define the world in terms of what is survivable and to contract around that definition. For Kim Basinger, it did not arrive as a sudden collapse. It arrived as a conclusion, the adult expression of something that had been present since a girl in Athens stayed home from school because she was afraid of what would happen to her mother if she left. The pattern was always there. The modeling years, the early acting years, the controlled environments of sets and studios, these were manageable. The world outside those environments was a different question. The moment that defined it publicly, though it happened privately, in a neighborhood health food store on an ordinary afternoon, came during what should have been an unremarkable errand. In her own words from Red Table Talk in 2022, "I was going down aisle number 3. My basket was almost full, and I found something really overcoming me in such a way that I couldn't breathe. So I left the basket and I made it to my car, and that was the last time I drove for almost 6-7 months." A grocery basket, left in aisle 3, not in a film, not as a performance, just a basket on a linoleum floor in a neighborhood health food store, and a woman walking to her car who did not know that would be the last time she drove for 6 or 7 months. She eventually stopped leaving the house, could not go to dinner, could not have people to dinner. The condition that had begun as a child's fear of something happening to her mother had arrived in adult form as a complete withdrawal from the world that had spent years consuming her image. This is the specific paradox at the center of this story. The woman on every magazine cover, the woman the industry had decided was, above all things, visible, was also, in the same years, a woman who could not complete a grocery run. The public image and the private reality had never been further apart, and the industry that published every photograph had no column, no caption, no credit line for what was happening on the other side of the lens. She could not solve this with the face. The face was not the relevant instrument. The body had made a decision, and the career, the magazine covers, the credit lines, the audience's consuming attention had no authority over it. What she chose to do with that invisible reality is the part the cameras were not present for. She eventually sought help. She eventually began, as she has described it, relearning the world in increments. The career did not stop, but what it cost to maintain it during those years was never published alongside the film listings. The grocery store in aisle 3 is not a dramatic detail. It is the most precise coordinate in this entire story. Everything that came before it was building toward it. Everything that came after it was built in spite of it. Never Say Never Again arrived in 1983. Directed by Irvin Kershner, it brought Sean Connery back to the Bond role for the first time since 1971, and it gave Kim Basinger the role of Domino Patacci, the Bond girl. She had been hesitant. The Bond designation carried specific cultural weight that a woman who had been training at the neighborhood playhouse and building towards serious dramatic work would understand precisely. Bond girls were not, in the industry's established grammar, pathways to the roles she was interested in. They were categories. And once a category was attached to a name, the industry moved slowly to revise it. She took the role. The film gave her international visibility at a scale the modeling career had not. A face known in markets that Breck shampoo had not reached. A cultural designation that would precede her into every meeting for the next decade. What it cost is the part that sits alongside what it gave. The Bond girl category attached itself to her name and competed for years with every other thing she did, including things that were more interesting, more difficult, and more revealing of what the instrument could actually do. The Natural came the following year in 1984. Robert Redford, directed by Barry Levinson. Her role as Memo Paris earned her a Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actress. The nomination was evidence, early, clear evidence, that the industry was beginning to see what the Bond girl category had been obscuring. Memo Paris was not a simple character. She was morally complex, quietly dangerous, a woman who carried an interior life the camera had to work to access. Basinger gave it access. Then Fool for Love in 1985. Robert Altman directing a Sam Shepard adaptation, the most theatrically demanding, least commercially cushioned of her early dramatic work. This was the role that drew the most serious critical attention of the period. It asked her to inhabit a woman of deep, unpretty interior turbulence, to be unglamorous in the service of something true. And she did it in a film that the Bond girl designation was not designed to lead anyone toward. The most significant roles of this period, the ones that drew the most serious critical attention, were the ones that asked her to be something other than beautiful. That observation does not resolve itself here. It will return later in a different light, in a role that asked her to be exactly that, and that gave her the Academy Award for doing it. The Instrument was already fully formed in 1985. The industry had not yet built a room large enough for what it could do. 9.5 Weeks arrived in 1986, Adrian Lyne directing, Mickey Rourke co-starring. Kim Basinger as Elizabeth, a woman making a conscious and fully aware decision to inhabit a dynamic that the audience is meant to find both uncomfortable and compelling. A woman whose surrender is not passive but chosen, whose interiority is present even when the frame does not follow it. The film was controversial. It was a commercial success internationally before it found its American audience. What it did to her career in practical terms was attach another category to the one the Bond film had already established. The erotic icon, placed alongside the sex symbol, placed alongside the Bond girl. A layering of labels that competed, loudly, with everything the neighborhood playhouse training and the Fool for Love performance had been building toward. The Razzie nomination came in 1987. It is part of the record. It is also evidence, stated plainly, of how the industry's dismissal of her as a serious performer operated in real time. The same woman, the same instrument, the same year, receiving a Razzie in one room and building the career that would eventually receive the Academy Award in another. Batman arrived in 1989. Tim Burton directing, the highest-grossing film of her career. Vicki Vale, the photojournalist who matters to Bruce Wayne, who moves through a Tim Burton Gotham in a white suit and carries the emotional weight of a film that is not ultimately about her. The film's producer was John Peters, with whom she was in a relationship during production, a fact that is documented and belongs in the record without fabrication of its private dimensions. She left her first marriage to Ron Britton in November 1988 at the height of the Batman production period. Batman was the most commercially successful film she had ever made, and it had the least to say about who Kim Basinger actually was. The mainstream box office credibility it gave her was real. The A-list designation it confirmed was real. But the film's relationship to her as a performer, the way it positioned her as the woman inside the male story, the emotional accessory to a protagonist whose name was in the title, was also the industry's continued preference, made visible at its most commercially amplified moment. She was, in 1989, the most visible she had ever been. The Breck girl had become the Bond girl, had become Vicki Vale. The face was on every poster. The camera had been recording everything she was willing to show it, and it had never once been given access to the thing that had been present since Aisle 3, since the girl in Athens, since the first panic that told her the world was not a safe place to be entirely open in. That reckoning was coming. What it would cost when it arrived, and what it would eventually produce, belongs to the next decade. The question of what Kim Basinger actually did when she stood in front of a camera, analyzed his craft, not admired his beauty, requires a specific answer, not an impressionistic one, not a superlative. The specific quality that distinguished her from other beautiful women in the same market, and there were many, and several were more aggressive in their pursuit of serious dramatic territory, was the capacity to be fully present to a camera, as though the camera was not there. To give the lens access to something that was not being performed for it. What the eyes did, or more precisely, what they did not do, was the instrument. They did not perform toward the frame. They inhabited the space on the other side of it. The stillness she could hold inside a moment, in a scene where another actor was filling the air with technique, had the quality of an interior that had decided not to close. This is not beauty. Beauty is photographable by anyone with the right light and the right angle. What she had was presence, and presence is made of something that the Ford modeling agency cannot manufacture, and the casting departments of the 1980s did not have adequate language for. A woman who spent her childhood hiding from public view and then spent her adult career standing inside it has a specific relationship with the concept of being seen. She knows from a very early age that the self that is shown and the self that is actual are not always the same thing. That knowledge, the gap between them, the negotiation between them, does not disappear when the cameras arrive. It goes into the performance. And what the camera keeps being drawn to in her best work is not the beauty, it is the knowing. She had spent 20 years being photographed by people who were certain they understood what they were looking at, and being understood by very few of them. The gift was most fully visible in precisely the roles the industry was not promoting as showcases. In Fool for Love, in the specific, understated intelligence of Memo Paris in The Natural, in the moments inside 9.5 Weeks where the performance went somewhere the movie did not follow. The instrument was operating at a level the surrounding material did not always match. This is what the category cost. Not only roles, though it cost roles, real ones, including a serious conversation about the lead in Eyes Wide Shut that did not ultimately go her way. It cost the critical vocabulary. When the frame around a performer is constructed entirely from visual categories, the most beautiful, the most photographed, the Bond girl, the sex symbol, the people assigning the categories are not looking for evidence of craft. They are confirming the category. And the instrument, in the meantime, keeps working. The camera keeps finding her. She keeps giving it something true. The industry would eventually catch up, but not before it had spent a decade and a half building a frame around her that was the wrong size for what was inside it. The Brazelton story begins in 1989, the same year Batman opened. She purchased approximately 1,691 acres of the town of Brazelton, Georgia, roughly 50 miles northeast of Atlanta, approximately 20 miles from her birthplace of Athens. The population was approximately 500 people. The total investment was approximately $20 million, though Basinger personally contributed closer to $600,000 of her own money. The remainder came from investment partners, including an Ameritech pension fund. The plan was a tourist destination, a film studio, a theme park, a film festival, a vision of her home state transformed into a place where the entertainment world could take root in the Georgia soil she had grown up in. The town had a hardware store. It had a dentist's office. It had 500 people who went to work and came home and did not know when the papers were being signed that their home was being purchased by a woman who owned a Bond girl credit and was trying in some private way to buy her way back to the place that had made her. 3 years later, only the furniture store and the dentist's office remained operating. The vision had not materialized. The investors were not satisfied. In a 1998 interview with Barbara Walters, Basinger said simply, nothing good came out of it, and that a rift within her family had resulted. The man who had worked at the hardware store for 52 years lost his position. The bank president lost her job. The dream that had been proposed to the people of Brazelton left behind a gap that the projected theme park was supposed to fill and did not. The purchase would eventually inspire a television show. Dan Levy has publicly confirmed that the premise of Schitt's Creek originated directly from the Brazelton story. That is documented. It is also, in its way, the quietest possible measure of what the experience cost. It became a premise for a comedy about a family that buys a town and loses everything, in which the comedy derives from the gap between the dream and the reality. The Boxing Helena lawsuit arrived from a different direction, but in the same season. In December 1990, the production company Mainline Pictures centered the screenplay for Boxing Helena, a film about a woman kept captive by a surgeon who amputates her limbs. Negotiations followed. A deal memo was written. No signed written contract was executed. She withdrew from the film. Mainline sued for breach of verbal contract. In 1993, a jury of 8 women and 4 men in a packed Los Angeles courtroom returned a unanimous verdict. $8.92 million, $7,421,694 in damages, and $1.5 million for bad faith denial of contract. The jury found that she had acted with fraud, malice, and oppression. Alec Baldwin was at her side as the verdict was read. She showed no emotion. The woman who had learned in childhood to contain what she felt in public, to show what was required rather than what was present, was in that courtroom. The same discipline, a different room, a different and much higher price. She filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy to manage the verdict. The appeals court eventually overturned the judgment, citing ambiguity in the special verdicts. In 1995, the case settled for approximately $3.8 million to Mainline and other creditors. 4 years of litigation concluded. She had bought an entire town and lost it. She had been found guilty of fraud and malice by a unanimous jury. She had filed for bankruptcy. She was about to give one of the most honored performances in the history of the Academy Awards. All of these things happened in the same decade. LA Confidential was released in 1997. Curtis Hanson directed it. The cast included Russell Crowe, Guy Pearce, Kevin Spacey, and Danny DeVito. And it included Kim Basinger as Lynn Bracken, a woman who has been surgically altered to resemble Veronica Lake, who works as a high-end prostitute managed by a man who makes his living constructing female images for powerful men's consumption. Think about the architecture of that casting for a moment. She was playing a woman whose physical appearance was the entirety of her product. A woman whose face had been literally remade to look like someone else. A woman who had learned to inhabit the surface so completely that most of the men around her never looked past it, and who contained, beneath the Veronica Lake hair and the tailored suits and the pale, composed presentation, a full human interior that the men in the film's Los Angeles rarely chose to investigate. This is not a coincidence of casting. This is a role that asked Kim Basinger to play, in fiction, the precise dynamic she had been navigating in reality for 20 years. The woman whose face had been processed, categorized, packaged, and sold by an industry that consistently chose not to look past it was now playing a character whose defining condition was exactly that transaction, made literal. She brought to Lynn Bracken something that no amount of research could have manufactured. She brought the experience of knowing that dynamic from inside it. How she played it? Not as a victim, not as a symbol, as a person who had chosen the terms of her own visibility with full awareness, and who carried the cost of that choice with a dignity the script honored and she honored in return. The performance is not about the hair or the clothes or the resemblance to a dead actress. It is about what it costs a person to decide that the surface is the available instrument, and to keep their own intactness quietly where no one in the transaction is required to look. On March 23, 1998, at the 70th Academy Awards ceremony, Kim Basinger won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for LA Confidential. She also won the Golden Globe, the Screen Actors Guild Award, and the Southeastern Film Critics Association Award. Return for a moment to the girl who could not address the class without feeling the world closing in, who faked illness to go home to her mother, who stood at an Athens Junior Miss pageant at 16 and learned to hold the interior still while the exterior performed. Now place her at the Oscar podium. The distance between those two moments is the full span of what she built. Let that stand on its own for a moment before the next observation arrives. She had gone from a bankruptcy verdict of nearly $9 million and the sale of an entire Georgia town at a 95% loss to the Academy Award podium in approximately 4 years. The industry that had spent 15 years putting her inside other people's stories, Bond stories, superhero stories, male desire as narrative engine, had finally given her the award for the role that let her play the truth of what those other stories had been doing to a person. Lynn Bracken was a woman constructed to be seen in a specific way by specific men for a specific price. Kim Basinger won the Academy Award for understanding that from the inside. The private life had been running parallel to all of this. It deserves its own reckoning, delivered with the same care and without the tabloid frame that the industry and its press applied to it at the time. Her first husband was Ron Snyder, a makeup artist. They married on October 12, 1980. At her request, he changed his surname. She asked that he choose something that began with a B so she could keep her own initials. He chose Britton. He became Ron Britton. They were together through the modeling years, the early acting years, the Bond film, The Natural, 9.5 Weeks. The marriage ended in 1989, the same year Batman opened, the same year she purchased Brazelton. The alimony, by reported accounts, was approximately $9,000 a month for close to a decade. She left the marriage for John Peters, the Batman producer, in November 1988. That relationship did not survive the film that connected them. Before it ended, and before the decade fully turned, there was Prince. The relationship with Prince in 1989, before she met Alec Baldwin, was, by every account, intense and unconventional. They recorded an album together titled Hollywood Affair. After Prince's death in April 2016, she told the Daily Beast, "I don't really have boundaries, so I enjoyed that time of my life. It was a really special moment in time, and I have great memories. I don't put a lot of restrictions on myself, let's just put it that way." The words are hers. They carry the same quality as everything she has chosen to say publicly: specific, honest, unwilling to perform a version of the experience that conforms to what the interviewer expected to hear. Alec Baldwin came next. She met him on the set of The Marrying Man in 1991. They married in 1993. Their daughter, Ireland Elias Baldwin, was born in 1995. The marriage ended in 2002, one of the most publicly covered, most bitterly contested divorces that Hollywood had produced in that period. Ireland was 7 years old when the legal process began. The custody proceedings were prolonged and painful and conducted in significant part in the open, where coverage of celebrity divorce was still considered a legitimate form of entertainment journalism. Basinger has said of that period, "Divorce is hard on a kid no matter how you cut it, and ours was very public and nasty. So I brought up Ireland in a very unconventional way. I just wanted her to be free. If she wanted to have her friends over and write over the walls with pen, that was fine. I wanted her childhood to be full of love and light and animals and friends." Ireland Baldwin is now a public figure in her own right, a model, a social media presence, a woman who has built her own life and her own voice. She has a daughter named Holland. Kim Basinger is a grandmother. In 2022, Ireland and Kim appeared together on Red Table Talk, side by side. Two women and a shared history that included the divorce, the custody battle, the anxiety that runs through the family like a bloodline, the agoraphobia that the cameras had never been pointed at. They sat across from each other on that set and said the things that had not been said publicly before. Not as confession, not as spectacle, as two people who had finally found the room and the terms in which to say them. Since approximately 2014, Basinger has been in a relationship with Mitch Stone, a celebrity hairstylist. They were first photographed together in Hawaii. The relationship has been kept very private, which is, by now, fully consistent with her relationship to visibility on her own terms. The industry spent the 1980s making her the face of every blockbuster poster, and then spent the 1990s being surprised by what the face had been hiding. The misreading of Kim Basinger was specific and systematic. It began at the Ford Modeling Agency, which means it began before the acting career did. The industry received her beauty first. It built its initial category before she had made a single film, and categories in Hollywood are adhesive. They stick. They require sustained, contradictory evidence over a prolonged period before they begin to loosen. The evidence accumulated. The Golden Globe nomination for The Natural, 1984. The Altman work in Fool for Love, 1985. The moments inside 9.5 Weeks where the performance exceeded the material. The Pret-a-Porter Ensemble in 1994, with Altman again, the full cast receiving National Board of Review recognition. The agoraphobia years, during which she continued to work, to show up, to give performances, while managing something invisible that had no press agent and no publicist and no column inch devoted to it. The label missed all of it. Not through malice entirely, though the Razzie nomination suggests that some of the dismissal was active rather than passive, primarily through the industry's institutional preference for the category it had already built. A beautiful blonde woman from a modeling background in Hollywood in the 1980s was available to do specific things on screen. That was the available grammar. Her instrument exceeded the grammar, and the grammar is slow to expand for anyone, but it is particularly slow to expand for a woman whose appearance has already been assigned a function. Then 8 Mile arrived in 2002, Curtis Hanson directing again, the director who had given her LA Confidential, Eminem's film, Eminem's story, Eminem's Detroit. And in the role of Stephanie, the mother, living in a trailer, struggling, unglamorous, not positioned as anyone's object of desire or anyone's narrative reward, Kim Basinger gave a performance that was completely and deliberately human. Return for a moment to the Breck Girl, the magazine covers, the $1,000 a day, the face that a modeling agency had decided was the primary asset and the primary product. Now place that face in a Detroit trailer, playing a woman who is Eminem's mother. That is the full scale of the misreading, not the distance between the Breck Girl and the Bond Girl. Those are adjacent categories. The distance between the Breck Girl and Stephanie in 8 Mile. That is the width of the gap between what the industry filed her as and what the instrument was capable of. The industry was surprised by 8 Mile. She was not. Razzie nominations, an Oscar, a Bond Girl credit, an Altman ensemble, Eminem's mother in a Detroit trailer. These are not contradictions. They are the record of a single instrument being given different rooms, some of them large enough, most of them not, across 4 decades. The grocery store in aisle 3 returns now, but the viewer who has spent the last hour with this story sees it differently than they did when it first appeared. Because now the woman in that store is not an abstraction. She is the daughter of a D-Day veteran who played jazz, and a water ballet dancer who carried anxiety in private. She is the girl who stayed home from school to protect her mother from something the school counselors confirmed is real. She is the woman who trained at the neighborhood playhouse while paying her rent with her face. She is the Bond girl who turned down Charlie's Angels. She is the woman who bought a town and lost it, and who stood in a courtroom with no expression while a jury read a verdict of nearly $9 million. She is that person, standing in aisle 3 of a health food store on an ordinary afternoon with a basket that is almost full, and finding something overcoming her that she cannot breathe through. The agoraphobia she has described publicly is not a dramatic collapse. It is the body's conclusion about the cost of 30 years of managed exposure. The childhood anxiety that was confirmed by the school, the watching of her mother struggle with something similar, the years of training the exterior to present what was required while the interior conducted its own separate private negotiation, the bankruptcy, the verdict, the divorce, the cameras, the covers, the categories. The body eventually presents the bill. Agoraphobia, an anxiety disorder characterized by the avoidance of situations where escape might be difficult or where help might not be available during a panic attack, is related to generalized anxiety but is distinct from it. It has a geography. It defines the safe interior and the unsafe exterior with a clarity that no career achievement can override. And it is treatable, manageable, but it requires first the willingness to name it, to say, this is what is happening. This is what has been happening. This is what the cameras were not shown. She stopped leaving the house. She could not go to dinner. She could not have people to dinner. The woman on every magazine cover was also, in the same years, a woman whose world had contracted to the dimensions of what her body could survive. A woman whose face had been on the cover of every magazine in America was also, in those same years, a woman who could not walk through a grocery store, and the industry that had published every image never once published that truth. In 2022, on Red Table Talk, she named it, with Ireland beside her. The specific details, the specific language, the basket, the car, the 6 or 7 months, not as a confession extracted by a sympathetic interviewer, as a choice, a deliberate decision, made on her own terms, to say, here is what I was carrying while you were watching me. Let that sit for a moment before the next thought arrives. The people who watched that interview and recognized something they had also been carrying quietly, who had their own aisle 3s, their own baskets left behind, their own mornings when the world outside the door was not navigable, are the real record of what that moment contributed. No Oscar citation holds it. No box office number measures it. It is the contribution that required the most courage of anything she ever did in front of a camera. After the Oscar, After the bankruptcy settlement, after the Baldwin divorce, Kim Basinger made a series of choices that illuminate who she had always been beneath the categories the industry had constructed. 8 Mile in 2002 was the most visible of them, a deliberate step into territory that rejected every label the industry had assigned. She was paid $5 million for I Dreamed of Africa in 2000, in the role of Kooky Gallman, a salary that confirmed the commercial legitimacy of her post-Oscar standing, while the film itself was a less than triumphant vehicle for the scale of what she had by then established. Pret-a-Porter in 1994 had given her another Altman ensemble, another room full of people committed to craft over category. 50 Shades Darker in 2017 placed her back in territory the industry associated with the 1986 version of her career, which is its own observation about the narrowness of the frame Hollywood keeps reaching for when it books certain women. She appeared on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. She received the Athena Award from the Kudzu Film Festival, a lifetime achievement recognition in the cinematic arts. In 2011, the Los Angeles Times ranked her third on its list of the 50 most beautiful women in film history. The face, still being cataloged, still being organized into beauty rankings, still being filed under the primary category. Her animal rights advocacy has been a lifelong commitment, not a publicist's suggestion and not a periodic endorsement, but a consistent, documented engagement that has included PETA campaigns and a vegetarian life that predates its fashionability by decades. It is, perhaps, the least categorizable thing about her public record, the commitment that exists entirely outside the industry's preferred frame and that she has maintained regardless. Michael Keaton, her Batman co-star, the man who wore the suit in the film that was the most commercially successful of her career, has described her publicly as underrated, a peer, a man who was in the frame with her. His word is not the last one, but it is a credible one from someone who watched her work from 3 feet away. At 72, she lives in Los Angeles with Mitch Stone. She is a grandmother. Ireland's daughter Holland is the newest version of a family line that began with a man who landed in Normandy and a woman who danced in Esther Williams films, both of them carrying, in their different ways, a relationship with performance and with what it costs to stand where the camera points. She is not absent from the world. She has simply arrived at a different relationship with its visibility, one that she chose, on her own terms, after a lifetime of having the terms chosen for her. The quietness of that is not the absence of significance. It is the shape that significance takes when a person has finally decided what it is worth to be seen and what it is worth to be left alone. Kimala Ann Basinger was born on December 8, 1953 in Athens, Georgia. Her father walked through the smoke of Normandy and came home to play jazz. Her mother danced in films and carried anxiety in private, and passed both the gift and the weight of that combination to the daughter who watched her. She became the Breck shampoo girl and earned $1,000 a day in a business that bought and sold the surface. She trained at the neighborhood playhouse and built a craft the surface business had no category for. She was the Bond girl and Vicki Vale and Lynn Bracken and Eminem's mother in a Detroit trailer and a woman sitting on a Red Table Talk set at 70 years old saying what she had been carrying since aisle 3. She bought an entire town. She lost it at a 95% loss. She was found guilty of fraud and malice by a unanimous jury. She filed for bankruptcy. She was married twice, and the second marriage ended publicly and bitterly, with a 7-year-old daughter in the middle of it. She developed agoraphobia, a documented anxiety disorder, and stopped driving for 6 or 7 months and eventually stopped leaving the house. And eventually rebuilt her relationship with the world outside it, incrementally on her own terms. She won the Academy Award, the Golden Globe, and the Screen Actors Guild Award for a role that asked her to play a woman whose face had been remade to look like someone else and who was consumed as a surface by men who never investigated the interior. She played it from inside the experience. That is what the award was for. The one thing the achievement list cannot capture is the specific courage it took to name what the cameras had never been shown. To sit with her daughter on a television set at 70 years old and say, "Here is what I was carrying while you were watching me." No Oscar citation holds that. No ranking on a list of beautiful women measures it. It belongs in the record not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, and because truth told on one's own terms, is the rarest form of visibility. Return to the beginning. Athens, Georgia. A father who walked through Normandy and came home to play jazz. A mother who danced in films and was afraid of her own life. A girl who hid in plain sight, who could not address the class without feeling the world closing in. Who left her basket in aisle 3. Who stood in a courthouse with no expression as a jury read a verdict. Who stood at the Oscar podium 4 years later in a white dress. She gave Hollywood more than a face. She gave it the proof that the face is never the whole story. That behind the image the industry decides to sell is always a person the industry has not thought to ask about. She spent 40 years being asked about the image, and then, quietly, on her own terms, she began answering a different question entirely. The girl from Athens, Georgia, who would almost faint when asked to speak in class, who left her grocery basket in aisle 3 and walked to her car and did not drive again for months, who stood in a packed courtroom and showed no emotion as a jury read a verdict, who stood at the Oscar podium 4 years later in a white dress, was always more than any single frame could hold. She still is. If Kim Basinger was part of the cinema you grew up watching, if you saw the face and wondered what the face was carrying, leave a tribute below. Not only for the Oscar, for the years she kept going through things no magazine was ever going to publish. Honor that with a like and subscribe for more stories of women who built something lasting in the space between what the world saw and who they actually were.